Hi everyone, welcome to SVA's MA Curatorial Practice Program. My name is Brian Hornwood. I'm faculty member here and director of research, and I'd like to welcome you all for a kind of sneak peek into the Sharjah Biennial 14, which opens in March 2019. We have Hur Al-Qasimi here, President of Sharjah Art Foundation. We have two of the curators, Zoe Boot and Claire Tankans, joining us. Unfortunately, Omar Khalif could not make it due to an illness, so we wish him well. I was just thinking earlier, also I was getting a bit nervous because I started to look at the recent history of the Sharjah Biennial, which I have always, I think I have personally, I mean, not being a kind of biennial hopper by any stretch of the imagination, I have been to, I guess, probably at least the last 4 editions in one way or another, and it has always been such a welcoming place for me. I started to look at it kind of more schematically and realized like what a formidable institution this biennial is, and I started to become more nervous about it. And I mean, also if you look at the past few editions, right, there's something kind of strange that I never even really noticed myself. The 13th edition, the last one, curated by Christine Tolme. The edition before that, curated by Pinky Ju. The one before that, curated by Yuko Hasegawa. The one before that, Sudan Cotter, Rasha Salti, with Hega Vazian. And you look at this list and you notice the kind of incredible kind of preponderance of strong women. And you start to wonder in a place like New York, how this proportion of really powerful women compares to what we know here. Right? What we are familiar with in New York, it's almost like science fiction. So I mean, this was a surprise for me, and I think it has to be said that there's something to learn from there. By way of this evening, opening in March 2019, Sharjah Biennial 14 will showcase 3 unique exhibitions curated by Zoe Boot, Omar Khalif, and Claire Tankans, that explore the possibilities for creating art when history is increasingly fictionalized, when ideas of society are invariably displaced, when borders and beliefs are under constant renegotiation, and our material culture is under the constant threat of human destruction and climate degradation. To introduce our speakers for the evening, Hur Al-Qasimi is President and Director of Sharjah Art Foundation. She's a curator and practicing artist who received her BFA from the Slade School of Fine Art, London, a diploma in painting from the Royal Academy of Arts, London, and an MA in curating contemporary art from the Royal College of Art, London in 2008. In 2003, she was appointed curator of Sharjah Biennial 6, and has since continued as the Biennial Director. Al-Qasimi serves as on the board of directors for MoMA PS1, KAVE Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, Ashkal Awen in Beirut, and Darat Al-Funun in Amman. Zoe Boot is the artistic director of the Factory of Contemporary Art Center in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, with a focus on building critically thinking, historically conscious artistic communities. Boot previously served as executive director and curator of San Art in Ho Chi Minh City, director of international programs at Long March Project in Beijing, and assistant curator of contemporary Asian art at Queensland Art Gallery, Brisbane, Australia. Claire Tankans is a curator and scholar invested in the discourse and practice of the post-colonial politics of production and exhibition. Tankans' independent vision has been supported by an Andy Warhol Foundation Curatorial Fellowship, a Prince Claus Fund Artistic Production Grant, and 2 curatorial research fellowships from the Foundation for Arts Initiatives. She has curated for established and emerging international biennials, including Prospect New Orleans, the Gwangju Biennial, Cape Town Biennial, Biennale Benin, and the Göteborg Biennial. So for this evening, we will begin with, I think, short presentations from each of you. We'll do maybe a little discussion between us and open it up to the audience. To begin, let's give a warm welcome to Hur Al-Qasimi.
There you go.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to try to make my presentation. I'm going to try to make my presentation quick. Is that working?
Yeah, you have to speak right into it.
Lipstick. Yeah? Is that better? No? Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. Oops, it's on the slide? Okay. So I just wanted to briefly explain Sharjah Art Foundation. Our programs keep increasing. So this is basically, we started as a biennial, but slowly started doing more and more things. So it was important to create an umbrella foundation that would bridge everything together, because a biennial can only have its own identity each edition, and we have a full year program. We didn't want to have to spend a whole 2 years to bring in the audience, to staff people, to engage with the public. So we formed Sharjah Art Foundation. So this is a quick history. This is what Sharjah Biennial was like when I was growing up. In 1993, there was the old Expo Center. They're just pictures I got online, you can see. It was where the book fair was, it's a place of trade. And so for me, coming into this, all I knew really was Sharjah Biennial. As an artist, I was inspired to go and study painting, but realized that there was a lack and came back just to see what happens in the biennial process. And of course, I was the only woman in the committee. I was 22, and I asked way too many questions, and so they all quit. And it became my job. So that's in a nutshell. They said, do it yourself, and I had 6 months to do it. And I had artists help me install the exhibition. I was cleaning the floor the morning of. So I realized that the best education really is practice. So you can read as much as you want, but unless you actually do the work, hang the work, stick the labels, clean the floor, then you'll get the respect of other people who are working with you, including the technicians and other people. So this is a brief overview of the spaces that we use. This is the calligraphy square. We're housed in the old part of Sharjah. But increasingly, I wanted to step out of the Expo Center, which was a large space and needed for large installations. So we decided to build our spaces, new spaces within the old heritage city. So the alleyways connect. Our architect, who's been working with us for a while, and teaches at the university in Sharjah, the American University, until recently, looked at the aerial footage of the area and tried to be as close to, as sensitive as possible to the original space. And now UNESCO Heritage Site also want to include our new buildings within their protected heritage site, which is also nice. So nobody can touch it. So this is the old part of where we started. The offices are on the side. There's on the left side, Beit Sarkal, which was the first museum, and then the Art Institute, and you have the Art Museum on this side. This is an installation by Maider Lopez for Sharjah Biennial 9. So what's important for us is that when you're a government-funded project, you're using the public's money, so you have to really put back into the community. So more and more we started engaging with people who surround our neighborhoods and play. So this was a take on a lot of children play cricket outside their office, so she decided to put a football field. We do a lot of projects outdoors because the biennial is free, and it's really about engaging people no matter what your age or class or anything. So people just happen to stumble upon the exhibition. This was a project by Camp that they did about the sailors that dock ships just across the road. And every night, the sailors and anybody who were their friends or family would sit and wait for that film to start. So you could see people from the market just stopping. And it's a way to bring people together as well. And this is another installation in the market. So, of course, public projects are important. That's a bank by Superflex. I don't know if many of you know Superflex's project with the bank and talking about migration. This was a very successful project, so we decided to work on a new permanent park project in an existing park. So the biennial is almost like a trial, and then we think about what's lacking and organically grow. So these are just lots of pictures. We're housed next to an important Shia mosque, and Slavs and Tartars did a project right next to that, so that sometimes the projects really link to the culture of what's happening around it, and they talk a lot about Shia culture in their work. This was also a temporary oasis by Kirsten Gears, David Van Severen, architects, and it was housed outside an existing mosque and stayed well into a couple of years later, because the people who work in the mosque really liked having greenery around, so they asked us to keep it until the owners of the land decided to take it away and turn it into a car park. So this was another temporary project that became permanent. It was an outdoor cinema for Sharjah Biennial 11 by Epicek Pong, Versatile, and Oli Shireen, and it's remained now as our permanent outdoor cinema. And we use it for a film program, and now this new alternative film festival that will open in December. So these are pictures. There's MoMA, guys, just to see that a lot of the works that we produce and show end up in Western museums eventually. So it's really nice that a lot of international curators come to Sharjah to discover a lot of artists, and it's really rewarding for us to see their works and collections like Tate Modern or MoMA or Pompidou, etc. So this is one of the first biennials, the first biennial I worked on. Yes, Motoko Hinata. So we tried to really break tradition by including a lot of really adventurous or crazy performance art. So we had Motoko Hinata, who was a rabbit woman. We had Tetsumi Oramoto, who covered people's faces in bread. So it was a bit of a shock. I got attacked after the first biennial I did. So that was mainly by artists who weren't included. They wanted the traditional setting. So you need to be courageous and have thick skin to get far anyway. So these are just some images. Mona Hatoum's installation from 2007 in the old Expo Center. Another project we do is conservation and repurposing of old buildings. And there's a lot of research into architecture. This is the old flying saucer from '76. There was a bakery, so we have the old newspapers. And this is what it was when we were growing up, a supermarket. And then Hassan Khan installation in Sharjah Biennial 13. 12, sorry, I'm getting confused, 12. And then using it again for exhibition. The great thing about wanting to expand outside of the city, Sharjah is the only emirate that has two coasts and neighbors everybody else. So when we do a project in one space, people from the other emirate also are very close enough to visit. So you have more of an influence, especially on the East Coast. So we try to use a lot of old buildings and repurpose them. This is a building we're still working on. It's the old radio station, which was a radio station from the 70s, but a base for the British in the 20s. That was actually going to be demolished. I went to it and it was all boarded up with "to be demolished" signs. So that's we're working on that, focusing on a radio and music program. This is another building which features in John Akamfra's new film that you might see if you go to the Imperial War Museum. It's called Mimesis, African Soldier. It's an important building in the central region, which also saved. And the ice factory on the coast. I'll just go over them quickly. There's Klaus. There's another ice factory with Adrian Villaroja's installation that was later dismantled and taken to LA Mocha and repurposed and brought back on the way back to Sharjah, some of them. So you can see the materials that they used. It's a lot of pictures. This is another building. It's the 1970s cinema on the East Coast. Still the only cinema in town. It's been closed for a long time. Artists have used it for projects. but we're still working with architects to see if we can, we're still saving the building and to bring it back to life as a cinema and a public film school. So the idea of course you have the art college and you have universities, but we try and do as much public programming for people to take workshops and still be able to learn the craft of filmmaking. And it's a beautiful building, so. That's Shazia Iskandar's project in the cinema in Yuko's Biennial 11, you can see. And Hamria Art Center is also on the north coast. I don't know if I have new pictures actually, this is an old presentation, sorry. This is Blessings Upon the Land of My Love by Imran Qureshi. Maybe some of you saw it later at the rooftop of the Met, which has a different context. When he did it in Sharjah, it was during the so-called Arab Spring. So of course it had a little bit more of a meaning, and the place, it's a very raw finish, and it really felt like blood going into the drains. It didn't, unfortunately, have the same feeling on the rooftop of the Met. So, location, there it is, rooftop of the Met. Not quite. This is from Unji's Biennial, Julie Mehretu, Michael Ju, another using public spaces, the warehouse. We try and use as many spaces as we can, and just so that people can discover the city, and also to highlight certain parts of the city that are maybe under threat or going to be changed. So here you can just see, I'll just put more pictures, sorry. It's quick. Of course, there's a lot of pictures of children, because I think it's really important that a lot of our public are children who come without their parents, because it's free, it's open, they live in the neighborhood, and again, it's not art for the elite, it's not a museum where you feel like you're inhibited to enter through the door or buy a ticket, and I think that's really the important thing. So, I think I'll be close. So these, for example, saying these children, the same children grow up, they live in the neighborhood, and they come to all the film screenings, all the performances, and they ask a lot of questions. This was a Kabakov exhibition, and they said, "Oh, miss, did you paint this?" I said, "No," and I explained to them. And then I see them again waiting for the film to start, and they would say, "Is this film in English or Arabic?" And we saw all the exhibitions. So it's really rewarding to have that experience. Well, Shawki's film that we co-produced with the Serpentine and Vienna Festival. And we decided what's unique about our spaces are the old buildings. So to create an installation and an experience that wouldn't be repeated somewhere else. So we had this film's premiere at the Serpentine, but it was a different experience than having it on site there in Sharjah. And we host a lot of meetings in the local market as well. We did a project of the urban garden, so the community garden. And these were the pictures at the beginning of the garden, which is used for public programming. And the people that live around the neighborhood actually look after it. So this is we do a project called the March Project, inviting artists who have recently graduated or early on in their careers to do a site-specific installation. And from this installation, this artist ended up going to the current Liverpool Biennial. And they use this image for their advertising. We also do a lot of exhibitions for artists who are much older and have a long career, but never really got the platform to show their work. So Abdel Haim Salam is a Palestinian freedom fighter, a self-taught artist, and made these works on with sawdust and clay. Public processions, Papi Abatani, where people walk through the street and the crowds just get bigger and bigger, people joining in. And I have to stress that the Biennial has been doing projects like this for a long time. People always think, how does the public react to really contemporary things or performances? Everybody's used to it. They know every 2 years something is going to happen. So there you have Nikhil Chopra getting ready for his performance. There. And I think the best thing as well is seeing the art students and a lot of people coming in from countries who won't have access to go to the West. We have a lot of young artists that come from Saudi Arabia, that come from the Middle East, from Karachi, because Sharjah Biennial is a place for them to learn about art. We do projects for the police as well. So everybody comes, everybody wants tours, so you have the police as well visiting. And we have a art education program, so for all ages and with disabilities. We work with the local Center for Disabilities. So, and that's it. I have to be quick. Thank you.
Good evening. I think my mic is better than yours. Pleasure to be here, especially with the MA of curatorial practice as the house. Practice that I've been long committed to a particular part of the world where we don't have curators. They're on the burgeoning rise, we hope. But it's a pleasure to be here. So, as one of the curators for Sharjah Biennial 14, Leaving the Echo Chamber, a topic that Claire, myself, and Amar came up together, with each of us having a different kind of response. My platform, called Journey Beyond the Arrow, has 29 different voices, predominantly from what I call the globalizing Souths. And by that I mean artists that come from the South, but don't necessarily only identify with one particular place within that geography. So, to begin with, I thought I'd give a bit of personal background. This is actually an exhibition that has long been in gestation in my head, as a consequence of some personal research that began in 2014. In 2014, I found myself taking a personal trip to Dakar, to Senegal, and I had taken a 48-hour journey over several economy flights, feeling like a piece of cardboard, and got off into a taxi with a wooden trunk propped up to keep the engine ticking, and it cranked and broke right outside the African Renaissance monument in Dakar. And I remember this is a photograph taken from the taxi, and I remember being utterly blown away that I'd travelled 48 hours from one communist bloc to see an icon from another communist bloc in Senegal. And thinking, my context can feel so far away and yet so near. Not long after, I also took another personal research trip to Elmina in Ghana, which is, if anyone knows, the point of the world that processed the largest number of slaves across the Atlantic. This is a Dutch fort, and it was an absolutely harrowing experience that I did with an art historian called Françoise Borges from Reunion Island, who happens to be a specialist in this particular histories. But she's also very committed to Southeast Asia, being a quarter Vietnamese, and she walked me past the Posabon shrines, which are the animist shrines to the seafaring communities of Elmina. Beautiful material. But what was most fascinating was the little house at the end of the main street, a little house on a hill called the Java Museum. And this was committed to the Belanda Hitam, the Black Dutchman, the Ghanaian princes who became trophies of the Dutch. They were taken to the major expositions at the time and then ended up being gifted to Indonesia, to Jakarta, where they married Indonesian wives, and they sent back batik and wayang puppetry and black and white photos of themselves in Indonesian gear. And it was at the end of this street, so on one end we have Elmina and Atlantic slave histories, and on the other we have Dutch colonial trade happening through the Dutch East Indies. Again, coming from Vietnam, where I'm living and working, committed to Southeast Asia, again, my context feeling so far away and yet so near. Following that, I started to think about artists' practice around me and began conversations with particular artists whose practices were somewhat connected to these histories, and you'll find the consequences of these conversations in my biennial. So what exactly is Journey Beyond the Arrow? I'm looking at the idea that you can't fly an arrow unless you have the bow. in the same way that you can't have an artistic practice unless you understand the context from which that production has been given birth. So it's a show that looks at context as the bow, and I'm looking at artists who are very committed to their locality, and most of these zones are in political poverty. So these artists are looking at the echo as language, as belief, as ritual, as cultural practice, and then looking at how their artwork gives a certain arrow of time that isn't the dominant echo chamber version that we are attributed and given an education. So much of the humanity that you see resonating in the work of my platform are challenging traditional customs. They're exacerbated by this algorithm of like that we exist today, and quite concerned with how we are governmentally devised in division, and yet we are economically entwined. There are 13 new commissions out of the 29, and the majority are visualizing histories of human movement that what I like to call through a combination of toolkits. So in much the way Journey Beyond the Arrow proposes a certain kit, I look at artists who use certain tools in their work as metaphors for unraveling certain narratives. Those narratives in the show concern the Indian Ocean and its colonial Arab exchange, the impact of Japanese occupation on Southeast Asia, gendered histories and how what would have happened if women had been more present in the writings, the role of unofficial histories contesting nation building, the instrumentalization of cultural nostalgia, and thinking of time and the giving of time in shaping human empathy. So just to give a little window, some of the imagery I'm sharing for each of these are indicative only because commissions are in process, quite obviously. So don't look at this as if you're seeing something that you'll see in the show. These are just indications. So John Pukuzawindanto was one of the artists I immediately started talking to when I returned from Ghana, in knowing that his commitment to Dutch histories was very present in his work. So he's looking at the Belanda Hitam, the Black Dutchman, but from an Indonesian perspective, because don't forget the Dutch East Indies had indigenous soldiers not only from Ghana, but from all over the Dutch Empire. So he's looking at certain cemetery sites, certain musical traditions that have continued as a consequence of the Belanda Hitam in Indonesia. When I came back from Senegal, I started talking to Tuan Andrew, a Vietnamese artist who had similarly had conversations with me about the role of West Africa in Indochina during French occupation. And he's doing work in Dakar in Senegal with the descendants of the French Senegalese soldiers who had Vietnamese wives who went back, some of them kidnapped and taken to Dakar. And he is working with several generations of people who are writing their own histories as exiles from a Vietnamese descendant perspective. I should mention that in this platform is a vast array of media. I forgot to say that. We have anything from painting to ink to tapestries to 3D immersive installations, sound, performance, music. And it's a vast, very broad amount of media. So looking at the instrumentalization of cultural nostalgia, Kidlat Tahimik, again, quite a personal project for me. This man has had immense influence on my practice. He's a 75-year-old going on 25-year-old man with much more energy than, I don't know where he gets it. But his first film in the 1980s, Perfume Nightmare, was picked up by Werner Herzog. He subsequently developed a film career as an essayist of the likes of Chris Marker, of which he was actually a colleague. But Tahimik is actually also an incredible sculptor and somebody whose installations appear in all his films and take on characters inside all of his narratives. His narratives being completely unfinished. Most of his films are still in process and he's in constant editing mode with his work. So in Sharjah Biennial 14 there is a specific commission of new sculptural work made specifically in response to what he calls Bathalana. Bathalana is an indigenous Filipino concept which means we make do with what's in front of us. His budgets are always super small when he does his film works. So Memories of Overdevelopment, which we see two stills above, deals with Enrique de Malaca, a Malayan slave who was purchased by Ferdinand Magellan, a man who was credited as the first to circumnavigate the globe. Kidlad has been very obsessed with this figure for most of his life, and his family members appear throughout the film from when they were little tots until they're now in their 40s. So through these films you also see a germination of media. So he started out in 16mm and then eventually became completely highly digital. Enrique de Malaca, however, is a figure not only present with Kidlad's work, and this is also a common thread in my platform. You'll see subjects and histories overlap. So there's another artist from Malaysia called Ahmad Fuad Osman, who has been similarly very obsessed with Enrique de Malaca. Whereas Kidlad looks at the journey that Enrique did across the world, Ahmad Fuad Osman is imagining what would have happened if Enrique's vision, his loot, had been classified, categorized, and being the marker of how we write histories. He has over 300 works, artifacts, that he has invested with his own meanings. They are essentially all fake. But this is what he claims to be a memorial to a very important hero to not only Malaysia, the Philippines, but also Indonesia. Then we also have the work of Karim Ali, an Afghani from Biennial, a Hazara targeted by the Taliban who now lives in Australia. Karim is looking, his practice has long engaged the Book of Kings, or the Shahnameh, which is one of the first texts to have ever written on mythological ideas of foundational religion. And in this particular major body of work, which encompasses tapestries, actually, there's a little video, I just remembered. He's, how do I make that? Oh, there we go. So he's looking at how religious symbols are hijacked by terrorism, by charity. In Afghanistan today, we have the everyday people looking at the Taliban as the main people who provide aid in times of earthquake, health and welfare, for example. On the right-hand side of the video, this is a studio in Isfahan in Iran, where he is making sound pieces out of these silver steel trumpets that are well identified in Afghanistan as the beacons of propaganda of the Taliban. Sorry, I wish I had more time. There's so much to run through, so I have to keep going. Gendered histories is also another element in the show, and we have Naomi Younger from South Africa, who is producing a new commission looking at the legacy of a very well-known figure across Pan-African memory, Miriam Makeba. But he is looking at her from the perspective of exile, the empowerment that she gave the voice of the role of Arab culture to African identities at a time when South Africa, her country, was entering apartheid. Lisa Rehana, a Maori from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and she's creating a 3D immersive environment with the help of Peter Jackson Studios, actually. And her work looks at the arrival of the first Pakeha, the white colonial woman, to arrive in New Zealand in the 1800s, and examines how this woman's acceptance into tribal law challenged the role of matriarch in Aotearoa. Basically, women prior to colonization were those that owned and possessed property. But with the arrival of the colonies, basically women were suddenly traded for guns. Then we have a focus on the Indian Ocean and its Arab exchange. And I have to say that the appointment or the invitation to work in Sharjah prompted me to really give focus to this, because, of course, working in Sharjah, I started to question the region I come from, its relevance to the Arab world. And I realized the Arab world actually came to us very, very early on. And a number of artists are looking at this from different perspectives. Shiraz Beju is a Mauritian currently based in the UK, and he's looking at the impact of the French Empire on Mauritius, but from a perspective that embraces Islam. As an Islamic man, he's really drawn to the colonial impact this had on his faith, particularly looking through film. It's a beautiful piece that has no human presence, and indeed it is the sound that stands in for humans in this work. Roslasham's-Meer, known as Ise, comes from Kelantan, North Malaysia near Borneo. And Kelantan is a very small little Islamic kingdom in the north. And he is rewriting Kelantan history via his own oral study. He's doing a lot of oral history research that is challenging the dominant Islamic mode of Malayan identities, actually. So he has quite a contentious relationship in Malaysia to his elders. And this particular work has been shown twice there to great discourse and debate. And I was quite appreciative of how open in Malaysia they are to rereading the origins of Islam to the Malay world. We then have a little focus on Japanese occupation on Southeast Asia. This is a very sensitive history to my part of the world. It's not something openly discussed still. Van Houen from Vietnam is looking at how when the Japanese occupied Vietnam in the north, they demanded the farmers stop planting rice and plant jute instead, jute being a material for weaponry. As a consequence, there was nearly 2 million people who died. This is a history completely of red tape in Vietnam. So she took it upon herself to do first-hand interviews. She's one of the first in Vietnam to do so. And she's creating a new film piece and a series of paintings in response. She tells me she'll also do a book now. She's created so much research on this. She says it deserves to be told. Miro Kazumi from Japan is looking at the inheritance of guilt as a consequence of Japanese involvement in this era, and particularly looking at the militarization of this memory. Miro, if you know his practice, is very well known for his scripts. He often creates these filmic narratives where you sit in front of them and feel like, okay, I understand, I completely get it, and you're nearly about to leave, and then he twists it in such a way that you feel compelled to sit and watch it again. So that's all I have for you tonight. I don't know if I went under or over my 20 minutes, but I do hope that you can come and see. There's so much more in the program for me. I didn't share the China to Africa focus at all that's present in the show, and there's a lot more work predominantly coming out of Southeast Asia in my platform, I have to say. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for staying on. Oh yes, thank you. I appreciate the logistical leg up. Thank you. So I am a member of next year's Sharjah Biennial curatorial triumvirate, if we might call it that. And I'm very pleased to be here with Hugo, of course with Zoe. Sad that our colleague Omar couldn't join us, as we said. You will, as you come to know more about our respective platform, and also Omar, appreciate the various overlap which will make of Sharjah Biennial 14 an ample selection of very complementary viewpoints from a generation of curators who share a common ground, I think, having come of age at a time when the notion of the post-colonial were already well established, and that from which our practices sprang. So I think it is significant to highlight, as we are possibly equal among some of the younger generation of curators appointed for the biennial. Yeah. But I do appreciate this generational premise that we all share. So look for me all around you is my contribution to Sharjah Biennial 14, leaving the echo chamber. My platform has the distinct feature of being entirely composed of new commission, to date the number of 28. In addition to being primarily focusing on new commission, I've also decided to give a voice to emerging artists, with emerging being understood regardless of age. And lastly, I am taking on a vast expanse, territorially speaking, in terms of Sharjah as a city, Sharjah as an emirate, and Sharjah as part of the broader Arabic Peninsula. Very much making full use of some of the venues that Ho introduced in her presentation on both the west and east coast and everywhere in between. Well, not quite everywhere, but somewhat in between, and even also possibly spreading to other emirates and pointing towards Iran. Look for me all around you, I like to think of as an open platform of migrant images and fugitive forms, composed of multiple scores drawn from the many scales of Sharjah, as I mentioned, in all its various forms. Now, one of the reasons why Look for Me All Around You is difficult to represent here and will be difficult to represent then in March of 2019 when it opens, is because it does in large part resist the representational. It desists from a representation. And this out of a well-known diasporic strategy, certainly shared among the African diaspora, of trying to find other ways than purely retinal to account for the unspeakable and the invisible. And certainly Look for Me All Around You calls for a repossession of perception and a redistribution of the sensible, to misquote Jonathan Crary and Jacques Rancière in their various accounts of the contemporary, of the modern and the contemporary. So that with Look for Me All Around You, I do entice the various audience members to exercise radical presence, to then borrow from Valérie Cassel-Olivier, who, not unlike other scholars, have taken upon themselves to chart other genealogies of performance practices, this is another distinct feature of Look for Me All Around You, a dedicated emphasis on performance of various forms, performance of bodies, performance of people, and performance of matter. If I can find the arrow, I will play this short clip. And with this movement without sound, as with many of the other images I will share, I'm simply cueing you into some of the very productions that are taking place right now, so that, for instance, what you see is a snippet of the work of Ulrich Lopez, an artist from both Mexico and Puerto Rico, currently based in Colombia, who has taken upon himself to re-perform a classical ballet that introduced the opening of the not the Olympic Games, the Chess Olympiads in Havana in 1966. And one of the final games was, as the title of the war indicates, of Capablanca, a Caribbean player, and the first and ever to have won the games, and Lasker, a former Russian champion. With this work, what Ulrich is interested in bringing back within a Caribbean context is not so much Cuba's great grand tradition of ballet, but instead the very African roots of some other dance forms. And to displace this project in Sharjah does much the same work of looking at some of the components of the Emirati population, particularly at a time, as I like to highlight, when the Emirate of Sharjah has taken upon itself to reopen a public space for debate around the cultural relationship between the Arab and the African worlds. And 2 weeks ago, Ho inaugurated Africa Hall, which will be followed by Africa Institute, and certainly many of the projects in Look For Me All Around You speak to various diasporic histories, including African diasporic histories. So Ulrich Lopez is only one of the many artists who works in performance, and again across many different modes. By performance of people, I mean to highlight the work of artists such as Misha Gaba or Mohamed Sakand, both of whom will do mass public processional performances, one in Sharjah, the other in Kalba. By performance of matter, I seek to highlight the work of artists who are very much rooted within the organic. And in the case of an artist like Daniel Lee, working with fungi, Nicolas Gensterer with light and shadows, Isabelle Louis with smell and sound. So very much thinking about the trance of post-human and the way in which we may begin to make sense of a world that is not solely predicated upon human relationships. These are other images of the work in progress of Ulrich Lopez. You can see on the left elements from the chess game that will be played live over the course of the performance, starting with 32 pawns and ending with 16, following the movement of one of the women games. And you can see some of the research that Ulrich has undertaken into the African costume tradition that will accompany Yoruba-style dances. Other works cited within performance, but ultimately that will take the form of a film, the work of Wu Tsang, again in collaboration with Fred Moten. Here what we see is work in development at Unpack, pretty much as we speak. Wu is experimenting with various forms of displays and performance. With one image is alive, the other unavailable, which will be looking at or establishing a relationship between Sharjah on the one hand and Athens on the other hand, very much looking at creating the elusive third space in which so many of the contemporary migratory stories with which we have to come to terms exist. Look For Me All Around You is conceived as a contrapuntal proposal to the realm of the retinal, as I began to indicate. Realm of the retinal, which is very much embedded within hegemonic structures of looking, learning, and feeling, where really what is being looked for is not necessarily what is being looked at. So again, I seek to desist from the immediate retinal prehension with which we tend to experience the visual arts within the gallery-based and object-centric context. These are notes on the optical architecture for a live work. Again, preparatory drawings towards a 7-camera apparatus, which Leo Asimota will use to reenact some of the rituals that have survived the sack of the city of Benin by the British in the late 19th century, as you may recall. Here, nothing of the performance is revealed, but simply Leo's plan towards its capture and later documentation. Along the lines of some of the works that question the very field of vision, and again, the retinal, the work of a young artist from the Emirates. I think it's very important to bring these artists within the conversation so that we may see what becomes of those young viewers of the Biennial upon which Ho placed so much emphasis. So I'm very, very pleased to be working with Ala. She will be placing on the rooftop of one of the gallery space these observational devices that will be pointing out to yet another site which Ho introduced, which is Bank Street, an area which will be undergoing redevelopment in the near future. So again, Look For Me All Around You is very context and site specific and really takes Sharjah as its broader canvas, if you will, unveiling many of its histories and sites. Also questioning the field of vision through sight, but also through the blinding effects of lights in the way in which it is used for surveilling purposes. Here, the relationship being established between the context of New York City, where J. Clayton is based, and that of the UAE, where public space is also under control and surveillance, maybe not so much in Sharjah, but certainly in the federal capital of Abu Dhabi with the Falcon Eye program. As concerns matter of the distinction between what we're looking at versus what we're looking for, I like to introduce the work of Alia Farid with the audience members of a performance that disrobed itself from our gaze. And we can see here an audience assembled in Kazan, a large island off of the coast of Iran. Alia is interested in the Iranian population and thinking at the Iranian diaspora back in the UAE, which form a significant portion of the population. May they have been inserted within the Emirati population or continue to be traders and merchants very prominent and visible in the city. This is a film that is currently in development at the time of the ebb. Gendered space, which is alluded to in these slides, is not the distinct interest in Alia with this work, but it is in the work of other artists, such as Cuban artist Carlos Martial, Filipina artist Aisa Jobson, and South African artist Tracy Rose. Aisa will be bringing an all-female Filipino cover band to Sharjah. One of the Emirates which actually does not have such entertainment yet. And then...
That's okay.
Okay, we'll yes.
As a local.
Yes, yes. But in terms of the Filipino cover band.
They do have.
Yes.
Yes.
An all-female one?
Yes.
And Tracy Rose is also planning an all-female performance for an all-female audience in the Sharjah's Ladies Club on ice. So back to Alia and giving in more into the content of the film and that which she went to record, which is Nowruz, the Fisherman's New Year. So these are not still from the actual film, but rather scouting, shots from her scouting a couple of months back. And still very much with these slides, interested in giving a sense of, the place of spectating. When we see these women sitting in the sand and looking out to a performance to take place. You can see the names of artists migrating in and out of said echo chamber and being assigned various threads, which I have termed variously the cosmo-ecological, very simply relating to an ecological sensibility rooted within a relationship to the cosmic, very much exemplified by works, some of which I have mentioned, Aline Bayana, Daniel Lee, Jennifer Loren, Guillermo Calzadilla, and Nicolas Gensterer. Just a quick note on the project that Aline Bayana is currently working on, bringing together the threat to natural ecosystems that represents the constructions of dams in two different locations in the world, the Amazonian forest on the one hand, around the Tapajos River, and the Adonis Valley in Lebanon. The technosensorial, very much exemplified by the work of artists such as Isabel Lewis and her collaborators, or Annie Dawson, or yet again Kelly Naoun and Jace Clayton, whom I have already mentioned. And another thread, more so than a theme, that I am very much interested in developing in Sharjah at this time, which acts a bit as a counter to the big museum developments in, for instance, the neighboring Emirate of Abu Dhabi, very much intent with the Louvre on providing a so-called global history with which we may be at odds. So I am really intent on reflecting on counter-museological displays, attentive to non-exhibitionist practices, and as you may recall, I come from a place where I like to think of post-colonial conditions of production and exhibition. And so to me, it is very important to question the museum and certainly the exhibitionary complex as a site that has too often gone unquestioned in terms of showcasing the material production of cultures or people that are of a different history and of a different place. So this is an important part of Look For Me All Around You, with the works of an artist like Leo Asimota I introduced, but also Mesha Gaba, well known for his Museum of Contemporary African Art, or Carlos Martiel, or yet again Peter Friedel, an artist who would certainly refute the term of the Museo Imaginal, just a little bit too much of a mouthful for him, but who, with the various apparatuses of display he will create, will really lead us to think about the historicity of the exhibition as a site of value for the object. So very excited to work with Peter. And then another distinct feature of Look For Me All Around You, and in a way that from which I began my investigation and my selection of works and projects, very much in, echoing some of Zoe's interest, and it is a way in which I am intent on unveiling to our scrutiny a global history that is looking at a comparison between the Americas and the Emirates. And the time space that I am looking at are both the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf of Oman, but also the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. And if at different time, and certainly different geographies, at times across shared populations, if looking at certain principles of development to do with resources and labor, there is much to be learned by comparing the development of these two distinct areas of the world. And so it is, of course, also for me, as a child of the Caribbean, a way to recenter my speech and my practice from, if not solely for, the Americas. And so, in keeping with this thread, I'm happy to introduce you to the work of Christopher Cozier, an artist from Trinidad and Tobago, the southernmost Caribbean island, proximate to Venezuela, and for that very reason, also bearing of oil in its soil. And what we see with this rather fantastic drawing is a drill bit as one of the foot of this intertwined figure rising, as do many constructions, in part thanks to the unveiling of this, well, by now not so recently discovered wealth, that is oil. Dig in to fly or get high is the title of this drawing, not of the work that Christopher will produce. But in thinking of the Emirates and the Americas in tandem, I am intent on revealing both the immiscibility of these regions' respective historical flows and the constitutive qualities of their contemporary manifestations. This is also a way for me, as Christopher is one of these artists who will prompt us to discover the very landscape out of which the contemporary Emirati societies have sprung, taking us into the desert, taking us into some of the sites of the high-rise development. I am intent on introducing you to some of these other works, which are likewise taking on the vast expanse of the space between the Americas and the Emirates. Tonkwase Dyson, who might be here with us this evening, is working on a piece called Otherwise History, which she encapsulates as being about blackness as a verb. So how can the notion of blackness as a political concept can be put into motion? This is a piece that will be performed by her collaborators, including Zach Fabry, who some of you may know. He's New York based. This is is a rendering of the work of Suchitra Matai, who is here with us in the audience, looking at various histories of migration across the Indian Ocean. We're bringing them back in Sharjah. This is a work that will take place about halfway between Sharjah and Kalba in a desert location. And what you see, the work of Algerian-born French artist Mohamed Bourouissa, is a one-to-one scaled rendition of Fanon's hospital in Blida. So in this case, a colonial mental scape sited between the west and east coast of Sharjah. And then even further afield, a project by New Orleans Airlift intent on thinking about the notion of the kinds of utopian communities that the various migrant population somehow create, if only for the time of the flight. The plane being, of course, that new diasporic mode of transportation here permanently stopped. And back to Christopher Cozy, and coming to the end of my presentation, really thinking about what are the material aftermaths, the displaced artifacts, the coded languages and the sonic disturbances that arise of this encroaching diasporization stemming out of both population but also object migration. So by diasporization, I do not solely seek to place an emphasis on human movement, but also on the movement of material culture. As Look for Me All Around You surges into the fugue to unsettle the chamber, it strives to release the echo, which we might think of as the commons. And also to honor another artist who is with us tonight, Cecilia Tripp, I would like for us to listen to a snippet of this fugue and this echo. Thank you. And of course, as I said, Cecilia is in the audience, and so it would be great to hear her speak about Even the Stars Look Lonesome, which brings us right back to matters of diasporization. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. So see you all in Sharjah in March. Then. 7th of March. One thing I forgot to mention in my introduction was also a really big thank you to Reem Shatib, who I think is a very important bow and arrow to shamelessly steal Zoe's analogy for Sharjah Art Foundation, for Sharjah Biennial, and for us being here tonight. So thanks, Reem. Maybe I'll just start with a few questions by pulling back out to the larger, even historical movement of the biennial for Curators. And I was wondering as you were speaking, because you were talking about the role of education in the biennial, but also locally and internationally. And it struck me also earlier looking at the last few editions how much not only the region has changed over the past few years, but then also how much the world has changed. I mean, 2 or 3 editions ago, it seems like a completely different place. So I was just wondering how you have seen the role of education changing already between local, regional, and international audiences.
Okay. I have to stress two things. We do have an educational program, but we also do another project we call community outreach, because for us it's about, of course, learning and workshops, but again, creating a space for people to spend time, if they're interested in music or film, to really come together and discuss these topics. So you have many universities, you have the schools, but exhibitions and especially the Biennial, for me, growing up was the best education. I ended up going to art school in London because of Sharjah Biennial, the old Sharjah Biennial. So for me, it was important to always put myself in the context of somebody growing up there and what experiences they would have, being part of this Biennial. And the world is getting smaller, so of course the global presence is always very important. And Sharjah being a place of movement, and Dubai airport, people flying in and out, there's constant migration, and we don't try to define our region, so our region is really borderless in a way.
Oh, and I also wanted to ask if any of you also have questions for each other, because I think you were saying earlier that also you're working on your own projects, and this is also a chance to see what's going on.
Well, I think I'm very interested in the way in which both Zoe and I share an interest in similar topics, but approach them in a radically different manner. I mean, there is an interest around the Indian Ocean, for instance, and its various Arab routes, be they of trade, of migration, of labor. But whereas you are diving into the narrative and the storytelling and the showing and telling, I am precisely withholding from veiling the consumption of certain subjects and certain bodies and certain histories. So I find it very interesting that we could be interested in these related subject matters, but again approach them from a radically different position, both of which I suspect we deem political in their own rights, but radically different nonetheless. So I'm just
Yeah, this was also something that I noticed. So in your presentation was also a very, it seemed a very clear desire to reorganize the understanding of how history is constructed. But this is also very can be a very delicate matter to politicize it without resorting to a certain kind of grand ideologies. But it seems also that you are working on many different levels to kind of carefully reorganize a certain conception of history.
I just spent the previous 2 hours with Guggenheim curators, and they were grilling me on a similar topic. And they were asking me, did my ideas come and then I find the work? Like, how did this relationship to politics, ideologies arise? And in actuality, I had never studied curating. I went and did art history, loved storytelling myself. But after working in museums, I started to feel that exhibition making was imposing a certain understanding on how artists work and produce, when in actuality they didn't understand it at all. I started to think that artistic practices were grossly undermined by the privileging of the aesthetic and the display. So when I left museums and went to work for artists in China firstly and then in Vietnam, what I tended to listen to was artists whose relationship to politics was incredibly measured. I've been working in communist contexts now for over a decade, and when you are running institutions that produce artists that want to display but cannot, their measured qualities in production impacts the way that I write and I conceive as a practice myself. So I would say that it's in thanks large part to the subtlety of message making in art that has made it an imperative to have it in my own practice. A lot of people don't quite understand how diverse and rich and yet how incredibly undernourished our relationship to politics can be in my part of the world. About 6 years ago, there was a study by the UNHCR that asked the populations of Southeast Asia under 35 their relationship to democracy. And it was an alarming number that came out saying that they would prefer to live under an authoritarian regime. So for me, culture has a very tenuous, a very critical presence in reminding what it means to own your own agency in the world. And I think that art is one of the last bastions to which we are given space to ruminate. And I've perceived Curators' role in facilitating that vision as absolutely crucial.
Yeah, it's really nice to also to present subtlety in relation to history and to politics, not as a luxury.
It's a
but
necessity.
yeah, so especially when we think about human migration and migration of peoples, of course, this is
It's been going on since we were eventuated in the world.
Yeah.
It's not actually anything new, as much as 20th century politics might only be looking at 20th century histories.
Yeah, and in this sense, even like grand narratives can actually be quite destructive, because the stories are already so complex. It's almost a matter of survival, or this kind of subtlety when it comes to diasporic movements. And I think also it was interesting in Claire, in your presentation, the way that you used musical figures. Yeah, you mentioned scales and scores, call response, very musical figures to describe, and even anti-retinal. You know, so like a completely other way of feeling or sensing politics.
Well, if criticisms may be formulated over the way in which Zoe approaches politics from what may be perceived as ideological because of the kinds of figures that are being unveiled. I think that criticism that could be leveled at Look For Me All Around You is precisely the opposite, which is that it may lack a historical grounding, not only because of the relative newness of the work being produced, but also of the way in which it seeks to, again, desist from an inscription of within representations. And for me, and the way in which I understand this, particularly from an American context, much as you may hear, I am not American, but have been residing in and out of the US for, maybe 17 years. To me, the way in which this is a political positioning is that the last thing I want to see is yet again an objectification of the othering and the suffering of bodies. And it is particularly important for me, paradoxically though this may seem, for there will be many bodies in motion in Sharjah, but temporarily so, and hopefully given or taking their own agency. But in a place where other bodies tend to be minored, it is very important for me for certain kinds of bodies to be given a particular kind of agencies, in particular kinds of circumstances, and not to, in a way, replicate the very injury that the telling and showing of certain kind of histories can provoke. So this is the way in which I understand my resistance to representation to be political from the context from which my interest, stem. But we shall see.
I just was struck just then also, it's interesting, a lot of the artists that I'm working with, the projects that they're producing could never be made visible in the places that they live and work. So I think that there is that tension also on the privilege of appearance.
Many of the works in Look For Me All Around You will appear and disappear, have a very light presence, and many of the works actually work on the very appearance and disappearance of the image. This is the case of a work which I would have loved to live stream a kind of a preview of. It's the work of Kali Naoun, who has a solo show at Maxi in Rome currently, and who is again resisting availing her reality in Lebanon from the point of view of telling, or reciting political facts, but simply introducing her to her daily surroundings with rather minor images. And again, you may remember the emphasis that I placed on a certain terminology in terms of migrant images and fugitive forms. And so again, following in the stem of many scholars whom I follow, from Fred Moten to Christina Sharp and Alexander Boelier, really thinking fugitivity and blackness as a site of political resistance, of course not.
So maybe we can open it up to the audience. In case you have any questions, I think there are also some of the artists from the exhibition in the audience who might also want to ask a question to their curators.
Okay, I guess I have to talk into the mic. Thank you so much. Maybe you spoke about this earlier, but I'm just curious. The theme of the show is leaving the echo chamber, right? So to me, that has a sound presence or a sound resonance, or some way to kind of think about the ideas around sound. So I'm just curious how that has kind of worked into your individual kind of curatorial project.
Well, Angel, nice to see you again. And I hope to have actually physically manifested the way in which sound has played a role in Look For Me All Around You, as Brian highlighted, beyond the metaphors around sound. It is, of course, one of, or rather, the sense of hearing. It's certainly one towards which one is called when trying to desist from, a purely retinal comprehension of the world. But leaving the echo chamber before being a sonic metaphor is really more so one that is that stems from a kind of a rampant political discourse. In fact, the expression is very much used in the media to refer to precisely the way in which we tend to comfort each other with like opinions, never challenging what the neighbor next door, who may have voted Trump, may think. And so again, I mean, that's at the very micro and kind of a local level, if you will. But in the case of Zoe, to her leaving the echo chamber is to write history from a Southeast Asian perspective, from a global Southern perspective. For me, it is very much about, again, attempting, this comparison between the Americas and the Emirates. It's any operation of decentering, whereby we might not so much living as much as reflecting back upon said echo chamber within which we tend to reside.
Just to give example of how sound does feature in Journey Beyond the Arrow, Ho Tzu Nien from Singapore has a project called the Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia. He's doing a new commission looking at how the bronze gongs from across Southeast Asia were the tools that differentiated one dynasty from another. What he's doing is collecting the significant gongs from the various countries across Southeast Asia, and he's looking at the letter R for resonance. For every letter of the alphabet, he has a different project attached to the critical dictionary of Southeast Asia. For the letter R, he is documenting the sounds of all of these various bronze, beautiful tools, and he's turning this into a different narrative of how to chart and visualize what has come to be known as Southeast Asia. It's also to be a performance where there will be a physical gong enacting with the film piece itself. I showed you a brief image earlier also of Kadim Ali from Afghanistan, who is creating sound pieces out of these silver trumpets that are typically across Afghanistan purporting propaganda, but instead he is reading back certain Arabic chants through these machines that will be inside the show. Also attached to Kadim's project, he is bringing one of the most well-known Shahnameh singers from Afghanistan to sing the introduction and initiation of the tapestries in the space on the opening week. There are other sound elements also in my platform, which you'll have to come and see. This is less questions than I get in Vietnam.
Interesting.
What's going on?
Just to fill the space a bit, first thank you for your talks, but I have a question for Zoe. I hope it's not taken as a flippant question, but you have mentioned a couple of times that you've worked in these communist regimes, and that makes it, I don't know if you said difficult or impossible for the artists to display their works. I wonder if you can elaborate more on that. And partially the reason I ask is this brings up for me questions about audience. If they can't reach their own local audiences and you're emphasizing identity in the global south, then who is the audience for these works, and what would it mean then to have an audience that is not, let's say, your native peoples? And secondly, I mean, how much, am I misrepresenting your statement? Or, I mean, how seriously do we take this idea that they can't represent their works in these countries? I mean, is that figure of speech, or is that literal?
Literal.
And in that case, do you have thoughts on the value of art that can pass the censor? I mean, if the censors can pick up on it, then what's the point in a sense? I mean, shouldn't it be able to get past them?
I could talk about this topic till the cows come home. I have a portfolio of at least a dozen plus projects over the last decade that I have done where I would call the exhibition the list of artists in collaboration with the Ministry of Culture, Sport and Tourism, to various names across the region, of course. After I left Museum World, I fundamentally was aware that a lot of the artists I was working with at that time were producing work that could never be visualized in their contexts. And I started to realize that their experience of display was completely set apart from the local people who fundamentally identify with the narratives that they're discussing. And I would come to conversations with them, what do you feel when you show these very sensitive topics to an audience that know nothing about how sensitive it is? And I was struck by a deep sense of humility and respect that says it's just a pleasure to be able to speak. Over the last 10 years in running organizations with artists that are fundamentally in existence because they cannot do what they want to do, I've learned the power of collective presence, which means you may not know what I make, you may not know what I say, but I am here. Because in China and Vietnam, gathering more than 5 people on a premise requires a license. And often that license, you can even be arrested, even if that license does exist. I guess from a curatorial perspective, when I think about audience, my own practice over the last 10 years has majoritively operated underground. I must admit I was actually quite shocked when Paul reached out and asked if I would be interested in curating a biennial, because much of my own practice has been curating discourse, curating education, and making work underground with artists and doing shows underground that haven't had any visibility. And so I was surprised to be given this opportunity. It was a real, I can't tell you how many artists I'm working with on my platform who I've been in conversation with for nearly 15 years, but have never been able to do what they're doing fundamentally because they haven't had a visible opportunity, or they just haven't had the money. So audiences exist in very different places in very different ways. They can be your friends in a bedroom, they can be the lecture body that exists online, it can be that foreign audience that you might meet once and develop just one email thread. Consequently, my own relationship to Karim Ali was by sitting in a glass box of a very privileged museum and receiving an email from him one day that said, "Dear Madame, check work, Karim." And a litany of miniature paintings at the bottom of the email that were just so exquisite. And as a consequence of constant email exchange with him over the next 8 years, we managed to get this Hazara suicide bombing target to Australia. And he's now a trustee member of the Art Gallery of New South Wales and a leading figure in the arts in Australia. So audiences can start in very different ways and different functions, and it's not always about, from my perspective, artists are not just art makers. They are builders of community, they are inheritance of particular forms of knowledge, and ultimately I believe artists need to be able to speak. Not just in terms of show various forms of production, but I'm a big believer in articulation. So actually a lot of my artists are brilliant writers, good speakers, and if you come to the March meetings in association with this Sharjah Biennial, you get to hear a number of the artists in my platform speak.
Thank you for a thoughtful response.
I had another question about terminology for both of you. If you would care to elaborate about, with Zoe, politically poor, and with Claire, you say redistribution of the sensible. It's like both like really got my ear, and it'd be nice to hear more.
Well, for me, to put back-to-back references to, in the case of redistribution of the sensible romancier, and in the case of repossession of perception, more important for me in many ways, quoting, or rather misquoting, Jonathan Curry, suspension of perception, spectacle, attention, and modern culture. Is a way to take a jab at the way in which modernity has been constructing from a very, of course, Eurocentric standpoint, even still following within an articulation of the contemporary by the French theorist Jacques Rancière. So it's important for me, through these intertextual references, to be a participant in the discourses being produced. Being produced. So for me also, in much the same way that I desist from representation, I also attempt to take a more poetical political approach to writing rather than thematical descriptive, if you will. So there's any numbers of terms which again have various meanings of references that are available across a broad spectrum. If we think, for instance, about the very title of my platform, Look For Me All Around You, you can appreciate the sentence for what it is and begin to wonder, what is the difference between, or the distance between the me and the you. But you may also know that this is a very well-known sentence that was spoken by Marcus Garvey in 1925 as he was about to be imprisoned on account of Trump mail fraud charges over his great grand and ever non-accomplished project of a repatriation of African diasporic population of the Americas to the African continent. So
there's various entry points into some of these various terminologies, and much as, again, thinking back about audiences, some may frown upon their relative unavailability. I think that they can actually open up other entry points into that which is being produced, which is not solely to go back to Zoe about the power of articulation at the level of art making, but also at the discord of meaning making within words. So this begins with my own use of language, modest though it of course is.
I should answer this. I went to the Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh this last year, and it was a panel on decoloniality. And I answered they were asking me about decoloniality in my region. And I said, how can you talk about decoloniality if you don't understand colonization? I think political poverty for me has been, again, a reflected symptom in the art world around me in the Asia-Pacific region. I think we take it for granted that we have the right to choose to be a vegetarian, to ride a bike, to grow our hair long, to not wear a dress, to choose to be a transsexual. I think these are all political decisions that we make, but we fail to understand that they are political. The relationship to politics has been hijacked by ideological extremes, and I live at the end point of that. And much of the artists I've worked with also. I think we take for granted that this relationship to choice matters. I've ceased to put an emphasis on whether we are a democratic world or not. I don't think in actuality democracy exists anymore. But I think that we do need to redefine our relationship to the political realm. And in my part of the world, I do a lot of work in trying to debunk the fear around choice. Because a lot of young people around me believe it's just not even anything to hope for. And I think artists, for me, one of the only brave beacons of that youth that understand they have agency and that what they make can impress and influence.
Hi, my question's for Hur, actually. As he's sitting there quietly. So this is more from the perspective of someone who just spent a significant amount of time in the Middle East. First of all, thank you to you and your family for everything you're doing for the arts. It's so incredibly palpable and significant that even I was looking to travel to the Caucasus and I saw you guys are restoring sites up there, your family is. So thanks for all you're doing for the arts out there. As a curator, I have immense respect for you. The Anna Bogag, I hope I'm pronouncing the last name, Bogagian exhibition that you had curated was one of the most beautiful I've seen in a very, very long time. And on that note, as you're continuously working so hard with the foundation and the Biennale, where do you see as a curator, as someone who's making a significant impact on the Gulf and the contemporary art scene in the Gulf, where do you see things being in about 10 years from now? How do you see us progressing? Because you are one of the visionaries in the region, so what direction do you see things going as a curator of, in the scene?
That's a tough question because somebody asked me this probably 10 years ago. What do you see everything in 10? And I don't try to look that far in advance because the way we've grown in the foundation has been very organic. So one step at a time. We try something out, it works, it grows. We started as a team of 4 people, now we have a team of over 220 people working at the foundation. So I always think it's important to take a chance, gut instinct. Of course, a lot of things are happening around us. When we started, nobody would fund us, nobody was interested. Luckily now we are getting funding and extra support. So it's just a lot of hard work and determination, but it's, of course, we have a lot of buildings that we're protecting and trying to work on, and those take time. We try to invite biennial curators well in advance of 3 years ahead, 3 years maybe, kind of. We're already working on 2021. So these things, of course, take time. So you have to start ahead. But I don't know where we'll be in 10 years' time. There's a lot of happening in the other Emirates, in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. So that also adds interest and also an alternative. So we try to also have something that's alternative to the art fair, alternative to the major international museums. So. Yeah, I don't know where we'll be in 10 years' time. I don't know. Yeah. We'll see. Yeah.
I think it's a great way to close, unless there are any burning, urgent questions. I guess we can also chat a little bit afterwards. Please join me in thanking.
Okay, so you can relax. You can just party.
Hi, I just want to thank you so much Thank you.